A question or concept I hear come up in real estate conversations quite often, frankly, is are developers making too much money? Or why don't they just make less money, right? So if real estate is expensive or rents are high and we're experiencing a national affordability crisis, one of the comments that often gets made is, well, I think developers are making too much money or home builders are making too much money, or I think, why don't they just make less money and rents will go down? And so one of the tensions that brings up is real estate is an investment, and in that investment, there are a couple concepts that really play into this effect. One is the idea of opportunity cost of capital, and the other is risk adjusted rate of return, right? So we'll kind of cover both quickly and then talk about why, even if they decided to make less money, rents still might not go down. So the risk adjusted rate of return has to do with when you are recruiting investors to invest in your project, they're looking at all the different things that they could invest in. And if they're going to take on additional risk, they want to be compensated for that risk. So when looking at your project, they're not necessarily going for the highest returns, but they are looking for market rate returns for that level of risk. So if it's a very risky project, they're going to want a higher rate of return on their capital. That includes equity investors and lenders, banks. If it is a less risky project, they'll accept a lower rate of return. So that is the risk adjusted rate of return. Every project in development or investment in general has a risk adjusted rate of return. That's how an investor looks at a project. And development, quite honestly, is very risky. So, by definition, the riskier investment of development is going to require higher rates of return to attract capital to invest to build a project. The other thing that is an impact here is the opportunity cost of capital. So, not only are they looking at their risk adjusted required rate of return, they're contemplating their opportunity cost. And that just means that when they're looking at one project compared to others, if they decide they have a limited amount of capital to invest, and if they decide to invest in your project, that means they're not investing in other projects. And so they have to look across the market for all types of projects, not just within real estate, but all types of investments, and decide, is this the best use of our capital? Because if we're using it in project A, we can't use it in project B. Everybody has that constraint. And so there's this tension where the developer can't decide to have lower returns on the project because the investors need to be compensated. The developer might decide to take a lower return for their own capital, but again, they're dealing with the same things. You can't require a lower return for market investors, and for yourself, if you're going to invest your own capital in real estate development, you're faced with the same tensions of opportunity cost of capital. If you're going to invest $100,000 in a project for real estate, or you could just invest in the stock market and the returns are the same, well, the stock market is going to be a lot less risky than a real estate investment deal. So you're constantly facing this tension of there's not a whole lot you can do to lower required rates of return for the real estate investors. The other issue that comes up in this is that even if an investor decided to take a lower return. So if I'm the developer and I want to make a lower return on a project, I decide to lower my profit by half, let's say. You could say, okay, well, great. If he's lowering his profits, then he can turn that money back into reduced rent, right? Because if I require to make less money, I don't have to charge as much rent based on the same cost for the project to make financial sense. I can still pay my investment partners. I can just pay myself less. If I do that and we're operating in a land constrained environment, the price of the land when I go to invest in a property is directly tied to whatever anybody else is willing to pay for it. And so if there's a lot of competition, that reduced profit on my end really means that I'm able to pay more for the land. So in fact, by accepting lower returns, I might actually only be able to pay more for the land, which means I get to do more projects, which is great. But that means my cost is now higher, and so I'm not necessarily going to be able to reduce rents. So it really is a fairly sticky concept that is tied directly to risk and to why developers make the returns that they do. In order for a deal to happen, it has to generate a certain amount of return, not only for the investor and the developer, but for the outside investors as well. And that's just a requirement of how the capitalist system works. And then there's the residual value of land, which also impacts. If I'm cutting cost or lowering my return threshold, really ultimately that means that in all likelihood in a constrained land environment, we're going to wind up being able to pay more for land and not save much on rents. The only way I could think of to reduce the returns required to invest in real estate are kind of twofold. You can address policies in the regulatory environment that make investment in real estate less risky. And if it's less risky, more people will be willing to participate on the investor side, and they will require lower rates of return for that investment. Again, that doesn't necessarily result in lower rents if we're still in a land constrained environment. The other opportunity, which is related, is to get more people involved in real estate. The more people who are involved in real estate development, the more personal and developer led return thresholds there are, right? So if I require a lower return on my investment than you do as a developer, again, I can't necessarily change the required rate of returns for my investment partners. But if I have a different way of looking at a deal, or I have a different uh, required rate of return, or I have a creative solution to deliver that real estate development project, the higher competition on that side allows for lower returns. And so it could actually drive the market down. It could make things more affordable. Again, you're competing with that constrained land environment. So if you tackle both of those, the regulatory and open up the availability of land, I do think you could impact lower prices by getting more people involved, delivering a wider variety of project types. Um, but that is a big, complicated process. And again, I don't think the answer is going to be driven by people just accepting lower returns for their investment, because ultimately you have to attract investors to a project. Nobody does real estate development by themselves and fully capitalizes it themselves 100% with their funds. And so there is always going to be a market driven requirement to have returns match the market required rate of return to attract that capital. So it's a very sticky and tricky subject. But if you've got questions about it, I'd love to hear it in the comments below and we can carry on the conversation.